sort of the aim I have with my talk is to do a little bit more of a conceptual approach to how to think about behavior change and behavior change interventions within the biodiversity conservation realm. And then I hope to hand it over to Eric to do more of the practical side, because I know he has a lot of good examples from Rare's excellent work in this area. So let me do this. So what is conservation relevant behavior? There's a lot of different behaviors you can think about in this context. And I really like how Liz has helped set up this sort of common bias that's been in the behavioral science literature that is focused on what I would say is pretty low impact behaviors. But there's a lot of behaviors that we as humans, with some variability across the world, have and perform that impact biodiversity. So obviously plastic pollution is one. So it is a major problem globally. And stopping or halting biodiversity or sort of plastic consumption and waste is definitely a lever for promoting biodiversity conservation. But there's much more than that. So behavior also applies to farmers, for example. Not only what sort of crops are they growing, but also what sort of fertilizers, if any, what sort of pesticides are they applying to produce the produce that they use. But also at the consumer sort of side, what sort of meat products, if any, are we consuming? We also, obviously, traveling, transportation, we can influence biodiversity, typically in a negative way. But we can also promote sort of conservation, biodiversity conservation through our investments, for example. So instead of investing in fossil fuel companies or in meat-related agriculture, we can sort of redistribute or shift our investments to investments or companies that are much more pro-biodiversity conservation. You can also think about other sort of actors that influence biodiversity directly, which could be fishermen, for example. It could be many other companies through which their actions are influencing biodiversity. Another sort of example of conservation relevant behavior is the sort of demand for wildlife products, some of them illegal wildlife products, which is a major driver of biodiversity loss, especially coming from parts of Asia, but also in Europe. So these are just some of the examples of the many different behaviors that directly or indirectly influence biodiversity. So with that in mind, I'll go to the next one. So when we start thinking about behavior, I think we have to acknowledge upfront that explaining behavior is just incredibly complicated. So behavior can be influenced by anything all the way back to genetics. So you'll see geneticists talking about certain gene expressions that might influence behavior, and you can take it all the way to the sort of the structural factors that more or less govern society and all the space in between that might have some sort of influence on why people perform the behavior that they do. And I think this sort of complexity also means that no discipline really has the answer. So there's no easy solutions about how to understand behavior, but also change behavior. But we have different pieces of a puzzle, but this puzzle is just very, very complicated. And we need to sort of not only acknowledge that, but also embrace that and be a little bit humble about what is actually possible. So having said that, I think behavioral science still has a lot of relevant knowledge to contribute. There is a literature that is relevant for biodiversity conservation or mitigating climate change that I would argue has not really been utilized yet. And for some, the good reason for why it hasn't been utilized, but I think there's definitely a potential there. But there's also a potential for behavioral science to contribute much more. And here I think we need closer sort of dialogue between scientists and also practitioners, again, which is why this event is incredibly important. So before I sort of go in and talk a little bit more about behavior change interventions, I thought I'd present a little bit of a sort of a framework that I find is pretty good way of thinking about what determines behavior. So I see this sort of as a rule of thumb kind of framework. Some of you might know it already. It's called the COM-B framework. And this is driven mostly from UCL researchers like Susan Mickey. And what they identify is three sort of overarching clusters of determinants. And you need these sort of three clusters together in terms of before a behavior can happen. So you need the capability to perform the behavior. You also need the motivation to perform the behavior. And you need, most importantly, the opportunity. So with capability, you can think about the physical capability. This could be, for example, be a fisherman or fisher that needs the sort of the physical capability of, for example, using the fishing equipment, or the farmer that has the physical strength to endure working on the farms. But you also need psychological capability. And this could, for example, be knowledge about what sort of behavior to perform, which ones, for example, don't have a high biodiversity impact. It could also be knowing that if you hunt for wild meat, for example, in a very local context, this could drive that species extinct. But then you also need to know what are the alternatives. And what we often talk about is the motivational component. Here we sort of work a little bit on a continuum from the more automatic sort of behavior. So this will be your habitual behavior, or behavior you don't really think that much about, to the more reflective sort of motion, deliberate behaviors. And it could be, for example, in the biodiversity case, be purchasing an illegal wildlife product that is especially an expensive one, or trophy hunting, for example, is another example of a behavior that we would generally think of as being a little bit more well thought out. For example, one, because illegal wildlife is illegal. But you also need the opportunity, and I think this cannot be underestimated how important this is. So in order for you to change your behavior, you need to have the opportunity to actually make that behavior change. For example, and this is not a good biodiversity example, but in the climate context, for example, you can have an ambition and a motivation to sort of change the way you transport yourself. And that could be, for example, taking public transportation. But in order for you to take that public transportation, you need it to be available and accessible. So if it's not there, it cannot be happen. And you can think about the same with eating a plant-based diet, for example. If vegan alternatives are not available in your neighborhood, it's very, very difficult, obviously, to be a vegan. So I think thinking in these sort of three clusters is a good rule of thumb when you try to identify what determines a specific behavior. So this is sort of a little bit of an introduction to, or a segue into talking about behavior change interventions and how to develop them. And for this, I'll rely on a framework that we published in a paper. I'll link to it towards the end, where we identify 6 steps in sort of developing a behavior change intervention. But I'll only talk about 5 just for the sake of time. So the first one is selecting a conservation target. So obviously we should start at sort of what is it that you're actually trying to conserve. So is this, for example, a specific species? Is this an ecosystem? Is it a group of ecosystems? Is it an specific area that you're interested in? So once you obviously thought about what is it, the conservation target you're interested in protecting, think about what are sort of the available and quantifiable information about sort of the well-being of this ecosystem of species. And if you talk about the species level, you could use the IUCN, for example, red list that talk about the abundance, for example. But it could also be other sort of evidence about the well-being of your conservation target. And when we do this sort of exercise, I think it's incredibly important that we are not only just sole actors operating without sort of consulting local stakeholders, for example. And with biodiversity, we get into the often very localized communities that might be affected by what sort of intervention you might implement. So I think interacting and understanding how local communities think about this is incredibly important. So this is sort of step 1, select your conservation target. So once you selected your conservation target, you can think about what is causing the decline, for example, of a species, or the declining well-being of an ecosystem. And Andrew Barford, who was my previous supervisor at the University of Cambridge, came up with this sort of tool that he called a threat chain. But some of you might also know it as sort of a theory of change. But you can use this sort of heuristical model to identify what is actually causing the decline and which sort of actors are influencing those causes. Because once you do this, you can identify whose actors' behavior needs changing. And through this sort of exercise, you can not only identify the key threats to the conservation target, but you can identify what sort of behaviors, if change would lead to X sort of change in the threats to the conservation target. And obviously, once you do this sort of exercise, you typically focus on one threat, but there might be multiple threats sort of harming an ecosystem, for example. So you might actually do this sort of thread chain exercise through several times. Anyway, but it's a good sort of tool to identify what sort of behaviors actually need changes and what are those actors. And to sort of help think about this sort of exercise, we created a table where we identified some of the different actors whose behavior might influence biodiversity and therefore might need changing. And here you can think about us as citizens. We do many sort of activities that will influence typically indirectly biodiversity, where we get a little bit more specific in terms of impacts of farmers, foresters, hunters, but also businesses, governments, etc. So there are many different actors whose behavior might need changing in order to protect a conservation target of interest. So I just put this up here to give some examples that it's not only consumers whose behavior we need to change, it could be many other people or many other actors. So now we sort of focused on, let's say we selected a target behavior of interest that we want to change. Then before we start thinking about what are possible ways of changing that, we should come back a little bit to some of the determinants or try to think about why is this behavior happening? So we want to understand the behavior before we intervene. And you'll be surprised by how many scientists or behavioral scientists sort of skip this step. So they go straight to the experiments. And I think this is a frivolous exercise or an insufficient use of our resources. Because what we really want to know is who performs this behavior and why do people perform it? But also sort of what is the context within which the behavior is performed and how often is the behavior performed? Because this will give us insights about not only what about possible ways of intervening and try to change the behavior, but also what is the timing where we can most effectively do this. And I think if you skip this sort of behavioral analysis, even a basic one, we can simply just end up wasting resources and sort of waste a good chance of actually promoting change. So I would strongly encourage all of you listeners not to skip this step. And this is also a reminder, I guess, to myself and my colleagues to not do this. But then let's say we've done a little bit of an analysis of what determines behavior. Then there are many different ways we can try to change a behavior. And these are not only nudging, for example, I'll come back to that, but there are there's a big catalog of different sorts of interventions that we can apply. And I think one of the troubles a little bit that some of us behavioral scientists worry about is that behavior change interventions are sometimes equaled nudging, for example. And I think this sort of eliminates or sort of reduces the space of what is actually possible. So, for example, at the individual level, so here we focus on specific individuals or specific groups, we can try to implement interventions that will improve a person's capability to perform a behavior that minimizes their impact on biodiversity or conservation target. For example, this could be training fishers to use less damaging fishing gear, but we can also try to increase the motivation to do this sort of behavior or make the behavior change. And again, this could be sort of communicating social norms within a specified social community. It could also be communicating dynamic norms so that a norm is changing, or for example, induce a sense of pride in local habitats and why it needs protecting. So these are the very individual specific sort of intervention. And these are obviously hiding a lot of heterogeneity and a lot of opportunity. But then we can also try to change behavior in another way. So for example, we can try to change the physical microenvironment. And this is what we normally would say is nudging or choice architecture. So this is where we manipulate or change specific features of a microenvironment. This could be anything from your local meeting room to how a supermarket is organized. What sort of products are available? For example, how are they positioned? How are they promoted? And this could, for example, be, you could alter the availability of vegetarian meals, for example. That's one way where you might try to increase the likelihood that people actually choose this. So this speaks of, for example, this example speaks to the opportunity element. We can also change the physical macro environment. So that could be, you think in terms of infrastructure, urban design, all these sort of characteristics will influence how people behave and also what is possible in terms of changing behavior. then what most people probably think about, or what most policymakers think about, is sort of the price of goods and services. So obviously you can institute taxes, like a carbon tax, for example, increase subsidies to biodiversity-friendly behavior, and other sort of material incentives. So I think this come natural to most policymakers. But we can also change the features of the institutional environment. So this could be increasing fines for, let's say, hunting for wild meat. It could be trophy hunting. This could be one way to sort of not only make it illegal, that's one option, or to at least increase the sanctions of doing these sort of biodiversity damaging behaviors. But it could also be, for example, procurement decisions or environmental sourcing contracts that might also influence behavior throughout the supply chain. So this is just a quick snapshot of all the different possibilities there is in terms of changing behavior. And these might not all of them be what we typically associate with the behavior change intervention. There's a really good resource if you want to look into to this a little bit more. So it's called the Human Behavior Change Project. And these are the same people who developed the COM-B framework that I presented earlier. So these are some excellent resources if you want to dive into this further. So just in terms of time, I'll just quickly go through an example of what is a capability motivation, for example, or a capability intervention. For example, if you want to change people's diet, they need to know how to cook sort of food products that have a lower biodiversity footprint, for example. So if you don't have the capabilities, it's unlikely that people will perform the new behavior. And one example of this was, for example, that offering Amazonian households coupons for chicken that was in an attempt to reduce the consumption of wild meat. That was only successful when they were also advised about how to cook the chicken. And the same in Denmark, for example, if you want chefs to cook more vegetarian-friendly or more vegetarian or plant-based meals, they need to know how to prepare this, and also need to know how to prepare delicious meals that people actually want to eat. So one example of an intervention is actually alter the curriculum at the cooking school. So once we now thought a little bit about the different possible interventions we might implement to change the behavior that ultimately influences our conservation target, we need to prioritize between them. And we need to prioritize based on what is the expected and most positive impact they might have on the conservation target. And here there are three different considerations. So one is the technical potential, and this is what we sometimes tend to only focus on. So what is the impact of the behavior change or the target behavior change if the intervention achieves its objectives? So this could be, what is the biodiversity, let's say, benefits or the benefits for the conservation target, let's say if everybody changed their diet to vegan. So this is what the technical possibility. So what is the technical possibility of this behavior change? But then we also need to think about, to what extent can the interventions that we might implement also change people's dietary choices, for example? So how, in other words, how effective is it in changing behavior? And here we would ideally like to look at some previous evidence to help sort of understand or get a proper estimate of its, or the behavior's plasticity, as we would call it. And then a final very important consideration is obviously what is feasible. So most people operate within, or most organizations operate within a strict sort of budget. So there are cost considerations, there are also feasibility consideration in terms of actually implementing the intervention in practice and reaching a large target audience. And when we prioritize, we should ideally think about all these three considerations together. Because if we ignore some of them, we might not actually select the ones that are the most impactful. For example, if we ignore feasibility, essentially we won't, that intervention won't have a big impact because it's not implemented. Or it's not implemented in the most ideal fashion because, for example, the implementers might lack the capability of actually delivering the intervention.
Kristian, 2 more minutes.
Yeah. Brilliant. This is my last slide, I hope.
Perfect.
So once we've sort of done this starting prioritize, now we want to implement the intervention. And once we implement the intervention, ideally, obviously, we would like to have a control group and to sort of see, is this intervention actually effective? Does it change behavior in any sort of way in a causal manner? And ideally, obviously, we'd also like to follow up later on to see, do the target audience stick to the behavior change? And then also, obviously, we want to evaluate how effective was the intervention. And finally, and I think this is really important, we should report our findings. No matter if the intervention was successful or unsuccessful, we should communicate this sort of evidence, because too many interventions, especially the ones that have no or very small influence or even negative effects, they don't go reported. So this sort of learning experience is hidden away from people. So we want to know what is the likely effectiveness of the intervention so we can most effectively choose the one that will change behavior in a context of interest. So I just want to point to some of the resources where I go into this in much more detail that we published a few years ago, because I can only scratch the surface. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.